Two from Galilee. A love story by Marjorie Holmes.
Today we begin our series of readings from Two from Galilee, copyright 1972 by Marjorie Holmes, published by Fleming Revell Company, all rights reserved. Two from Galilee is a love story of Mary and Joseph, the parents of Jesus. We begin with Mary at age 13, follow through to the conception, and finally to the birth of the newborn King of Kings. You will notice that there are a number of truths from Scripture, and yet at the same time, she has based a story which is not to be found anywhere else but in her own mind. A combination of nonfiction with fiction. In Two from Galilee.
Chapter 1.
And now she was a woman. She was a woman like other women, and her step was light as she hurried along the bright new morning toward the well. She knew she need not tell the others. They would know the minute they saw her. They would read her secret in her proudly shining eyes, and she knew she need not tell her beloved, if indeed he was still her beloved, though to speak of it would have been an unthinkable thing anyway. He too would know. If, pray heaven, there were some way to see him before this day was past, she must arrange it, somehow. She would arrange it somehow. Anxiety mingled briefly with her joy, yet her resolve was firm. Her parents would be shocked if they suspected. She was a little shocked herself. But somehow, some way, before this day was over, she would see Joseph. Make him realize that at last she too was eligible to be betrothed, to be married. For she was a woman now. In the doorway, Hannah pulled back the heavy drapery which smelled musty from the long rains, and she watched her daughter go. Her eyes yearned after the small, lithe figure and the blowing cloak, balancing the jug upon her head almost gaily, despite the dragging pain that even Mary could not deny. "Let Salome go in and take your place," Hannah had offered, to spare her. But Mary had been insistent. "Of course not. She's younger. It's Yahweh's way with women, that's all, and all the more reason I should carry the water. I'm a woman now." "How long can I keep her?" Hannah grieved, watching her firstborn disappear at the bottom of the windy hill. "How long will it be? Surely the Lord gave me the comeliest girl in Nazareth." She turned back into the house with a proud, if baffled, sigh. "Never did boys regard me with such longing as boys have regarded Mary from the first time she ran playing in the streets. Never did my own mother look thus upon me." Mary was well past 13. Fortunately, her coming had been late. Something clanged harshly in Hannah. She herself had barely been 12 when given to the vigorous Joachim in marriage. But no, she would not dwell on that. He had proved to be a wonderful husband in the end, and if possible, he loved this exquisite daughter even more than she did. He would not be pressured into a betrothal even now. He would save Mary for the proper suitor. Sentimentalist though he was beneath that gruff exterior, Joachim would never yield to foolish pleas. When they gave over their Mary, it must be to someone both rich and wise, someone truly worthy of so exceptional a bride. The sun was fully up now, its pink light softening the objects in the rude, small room, the low table with its benches piled with cushions, the chest, the cold, unkindled oven. She'd better rouse the other children. But Hannah refrained a moment, savoring the thought of them sprawled on their pallets. "Mine," she thought, and shuddered at the never-ending wonder. Yes, even though Esau, the eldest son, was crippled and would never see the light of day, even so, out of these loins that were cold and empty so long. She pondered Mary's words, "the way of Yahweh with women." So bravely spoken, and so vulnerable, somehow. Hannah's breast ached, even as she gave a cryptic little laugh. She began to call the children crisply, that they might not suspect her emotions, and cracked a stick of kindling smartly across her bony knees. The hurt of being a woman. She would draw it into her own body if she could. She would spare her children the whole monstrous business. But no, not monstrous. She sternly corrected herself. Simply the Lord's reminder that women were less than men. An afterthought, a rib. And it struck her as wry and startling that he should design and deign to honor one of them by making her an instrument of his great plan. For it was to be out of a woman that the Messiah would come, a virgin, a young woman, not carved out of noble new-made clay like Adam, ready to smite the accursed Romans and bring Israel to her promised glory, not flung like a thunderbolt from the almighty hand. No, a squalling baby, rather. That's what the prophets said. Out of one of these self-same, humble, unworthy, bleeding bodies. And thus it was that every Jewish woman cherished her body for all its faults and thought, even I could be the one. Thus it was that mothers looked upon their daughters as they ripened and thought, even she. But not really. No, not really. There lay in Hannah a practical streak, as salty, flat, and final as the Dead Sea. She was not one to pray over long or fast and hear the fancied sounds of harps and angelic wings. She was not like her sister Elizabeth, whose husband was a priest at the temple and who consorted with the holy women there. She had Joachim and her 5 children, and for her that was enough. When the time came, and it was near, many thought, after 500 years of exile and slavery, it would come, that's all, and have little enough to do with her. There had been many children in the house of Hannah's father in Bethlehem, and they were very poor. Though he was of the priestly line of Aaron, her father's limbs were twisted, and since priests must be perfect of body, he was ineligible to serve. He had become instead a smith. He always stank of the forge and the fire, yet Hannah adored him. She was a wild little thing, and her favorite memories were of running with her brother Samuel into the hills or along the busy streets. Bethlehem. Now there was a town, no bigger than Nazareth, but always something doing. There was a great inn near the city gates. Its chambers and courtyards teemed with travelers on their way to Hebron and coastal cities in the south, or making a pilgrimage to nearby Jerusalem. Many of them were descendants of David, come to visit his birthplace. All were alien and exciting, drawing a noisy band of color across the provincial little Judean town. Hannah and Samuel dove in and around their hairy legs like agile rats, feeling the rough, bright robes that smelled of sweat and oil and musty spices and the dust of the great highways. They felt a boldness and a sense of special privilege as natives of this ancient cradle of Israel's greatest king. Jerusalem, too, lent them reflected glory. On clear days, tending goats on the hillside, they caught a glint of its dazzling colonnades, and the haze of its holy smoke paled the skies. You could even catch whiffs of the meals the priests were forever cooking on their altars to feed the vanity of God. The scent made the jaws leak, for meat was scarce in the house of a humble servant. And then suddenly, she was no longer a rowdy scamp running free when she should have been home spinning and learning of womanly things. A bloody hand had smitten her in the night. She hid her horror as best she could for 2 days, when her mother noticed her unnatural silence and put her mind ironically at rest. It meant only that she must leave off being a child, since she was now herself ready to beget. The eyes that regarded her were filled with both agitation and tenderness. Their message was clear. Though heaven knows what manner of man will have you, then, hopefully, our kinsmen from Nazareth will be coming for the Passover feast. It may be that their son Joachim... It was accomplished with almost unseemly haste. Before the year was out, she was setting forth with her new husband for the unknown hills of Galilee. Whither thou goest, I will go. The words of Ruth throbbed with new significance. Hannah turned wet eyes for one last look at Bethlehem. then put her small, trembling hand into the big, rough, sheltering one of Joachim. Joachim, huge, with a healthy red complexion and a thatch of dry red hair, saying little either from shyness or reserve, and when he did speak, in a countrified accent, yet a man with a queer dignity about him and the look of a deep and secret pondering in his eyes, the look, too, of some recent pain. She was mad to know him completely, hurl all her energies upon him, possess him, love him. Yet the shock of the marriage bed had been an evil dream. An evil dream, all of it, the journey to Nazareth, and having to live with Joachim's mother in the home of his older brother. Hannah had fallen ill, and when after many months she did recover, her womb was as frozen ground. If Joachim hadn't been a man of immense patience and devotion, he would have divorced her, but bravely he had endured the disgrace of a wife who remained barren while all his sisters bred. He suffered no word to be spoken against her by his mother, who was certainly no Naomi, but then Hannah was no Ruth. He even helped her with the water pots sometimes and brought her such small gifts as he could afford from the marketplace. Why then had she so often berated herself? Why was it that she could scarcely bear his touch? For she had come to know what a wretched thing she was, and that for the first time she was completely loved. At length Joachim's mother had died, and the few acres they had tilled together belonged to his brother Simon. At first it seemed a hard thing moving to a smaller mud-brick house and striving to live on what Joachim could earn as a laborer until he could buy a little plot of his own land. Actually, it had opened the sluice gates to happiness. Oh, the blessed silence after the clacking tongues, the joy of being mistress of your own house, however rude it was. The house stood on the crest of a hill, commanding a view of the rich green pasture lands and orchards that made Nazareth the flower of all Galilee. As people claimed, even though it was but an insignificant hamlet, cut off from the main trade routes, now as she was slowly waking to herself as a woman, Hannah wakened to the beauty of this place. The surrounding hills shimmered with the gold and bronze of grain in season, the purple-green tones of the vineyards, the silver of olive groves. White clouds coasted across the face of Mount Gilboa, trailing her ships of shadow. To the east lay the shining Mediterranean, and even nearer to the west, beyond Mount Tabor, the lovely flashing lake of Galilee. One day Hannah stood in the doorway, gazing upon all this handiwork of God. To her surprise, for it was mid-afternoon, she saw Joachim toiling up the steep path toward her, a young kid struggling in his arms. It was the first offspring of their she-goat, which he had left off work to show her, and suddenly the sight of him, sunburned and sweaty, with the young thing bobbing against his chest, was as if all the heat of heaven had focused upon the chilled locks of her heart. Her breath came fast, and whereas she had been wont to gaze upon him boldly, without expression, now she lowered her eyes and wept. "Hannah, what is it? Are you ill?" her husband cried. She shook her head, but she could not stop weeping. She wept for all the lost years of unhappiness behind them, and for the happiness to come. She wept for love. Now came rapture, slow, insistent, tracking her down. Now a veritable explosion of rejoicing, so violent it was like pain. The sober, tough little face, set in its patterns of defensive rejection, began to break, to unfold. She caught herself smiling as she worked. She sang. She felt lean and free and newborn. She stretched. She yearned. She gave. And then, the miracle. It was discovered that Yahweh had at last blessed her womb. Hannah bore a daughter, almost too beautiful to believe. They called her Mary. Despite the fact that she had failed to bring forth a son, friends and relatives came to rejoice with them, and the couple were beside themselves with pride. Hannah particularly, for Joachim's happiness was tempered by his sense of obligation. It seemed to him that this child had been a direct answer to prayer, and as such must belong to God. He pondered long in silence, but when it was time for his wife's purification, he spoke to Hannah, even as she wrapped the baby in the shawl. When she is 5 years old, it might be well to take her to Jerusalem and present her to the priests. Hannah turned her back on him, appalled. "We have saved the redemption fee," she said. "Surely the Lord will be satisfied." Joachim, though, seemed not to hear. He was staring into the face of the sleeping infant. As a ward of the temple under the care of someone like Elizabeth, she would receive so much that we can't give her. Hannah, who knows what high destiny God might have for her if we were only willing to make the sacrifice? Elizabeth. The name rocked Hannah with an ancient torment. Elizabeth had always been so beautiful, so fortunate. Elizabeth, barren even longer than she had been. Yes, poor thing, but who had so much else to compensate. How could he even suggest that they give up their only treasure to someone like Elizabeth? As for a sacrifice, what kind of God was it that gave and then snatched back? Did the Lord with his multitudes have half the need of this hot little weight she held as either of them? But she dared not voice such blasphemies. She spoke tactfully to protect her interests. She did not dream that she spoke as a prophet. "Truly, this is a child of God," she said. "But surely the priests and women of the temple could never love her as we do, not even my own sister, nor raise her more righteously, nor even find her a better husband." Hannah gazed at the floor, then at the face of the child. A greedy awe. She saw its sweet promise, yet tasting already the inevitable loss. "She's going to be one of the most beautiful girls in Galilee. She'll have any man she wants." Joachim yielded. His own spirit was eased, and as time went on it was hard to say which one more passionately adored the child. Yet now that Yahweh had relented, he made up for lost time. Hannah was soon expecting again, and swiftly Mary was drawn to her father. He would swing her to the ceiling when she came rushing to greet him with her explosion of dusky curls and huge ecstatic eyes, or he would carry her about on his shoulders, talking to her in a whimsical way that amused Hannah while filling her with a vague contempt. She was uneasy with the poet who dwelt so strangely in this man of silence or blunt country speech. Sometimes he would lift Mary onto the back of the ox and let her ride as he plowed the rich, if rocky fields. What a little goddess she was, pagan almost, garlanded with the wild cornflowers and narcissus that Joachim plucked and braided for her. How she laughed and sang and goaded the gentle beast by tickling its flanks with an olive branch. Hannah argued and scolded. It was unseemly in a girl child, even if she didn't come to harm. But Joachim only laughed, though he yielded to his wife in most things. In this he had his way. The second child was a boy, but their jubilation was short-lived, for he was weak, very weak. And after the long bout with fever when he was 2, they had to accept the burden of his blindness and his twisted limbs. Hannah did so with all intensity of her nature. He was her heart, but now more than ever Mary became her pride. It exasperated Hannah that there could be anyone who failed to appreciate not only Mary's striking beauty, but her other remarkable qualities as well. She lived in a perpetual frenzy of comparison, choked and galled when her sisters-in-law boasted about their daughters. To Mary's embarrassment, Hannah had to surpass them, and she could not hold her tongue. "Mother, please," Mary pleaded. "Remember what the proverb says, 'Pride goeth before a fall.'" It brought Hannah up short, but she retorted, "See that you remember that, and never give us cause to hang our heads." This morning, slapping the cakes onto the now glowing coals for breakfast, Hannah smiled a trifle guiltily to remember, as if Mary could ever cause them shame. For Mary was all the things she claimed and more. Things that, maddeningly, you could not convey to outsiders, even sweaty and laughing from playing as a little girl, or grubby from toil. There had always been this queer delicacy of her person, this quality of gentleness, as if she were truly a king's child. She was patient and helpful with the younger children. Her wit brightened the darkest days. If she had faults, they were but the kind that gave her flavor. a fierce allegiance to her father, something shutting Hannah out, a tendency to dream over the spindle. And she was not content with the old songs and tales. This worried her mother most, but would make up songs and stories of her own. If she were a boy, she might have been another David or Solomon, said Joachim. But Hannah had small patience with such imaginings. A girl should never be anything but the mouthpiece of the truth. The truth. Sternly, Hannah examined her own concept of Mary, even allowing for prejudice. Surely if a daughter was well-nigh perfect, that daughter was her own. And most of the village knew it as well. Certainly the young men knew it. Not one of Mary's cousins could claim such impressive suitors as had already approached Joachim. Hannah tallied them up. Abner, whose family traced their lineage to the first high priest of the land, but who supported themselves as sandal makers. Abner, tall, gaunt, sweet-natured, but rather remote, forever poring over his books. His parents had scraped up the money to send him to Jerusalem for study. He aspired to be a priest and serve in the temple, and it seemed likely he would succeed. Hannah could not but be tempted as she visualized Mary living near its splendors, her days heightened by its constant procession of holy and important people. And then there was Cleophas, son of Reb Levi, a town elder and its richest citizen. He had dealt in silks and spices and fine stuffs which most of Nazareth was too poor except to admire. He was forever sending Cleophas on trips to Capharnaum and Sidon. Joachim's relatives buzzed that the family dealt with agents of Herod, although Hannah marked that up to jealousy. Certainly Cleophas was a handsome, if somewhat wild and arrogant boy, and he doted on Mary. Sought her out at the grape treadings and sheep shearings and dancing and wedding feasts. Hannah's blood quickened when she thought of the fine house of stone and cedar wood of which Mary might one day be mistress. The gems and elegant fabrics she would surely enhance her loveliness. Joachim had put both fathers off when they sounded him out last year. Not wishing to admit that Mary was not yet nubile, he had said merely in his authoritative way, "We need her. There's plenty of time." Yes, time. Plenty of time, even now. Hannah reassured herself of that, for she had wearied already of thinking of suitors. She could feel one of her headaches coming on. No, she would not allow herself to think of others, especially not one. Yet Joseph's tall, splendid body seemed to invade the tiny room. His sea-gray eyes seemed to haunt her, demanding, insistent, and so she must cope with him. Jacob, his father, was also of the stock of Jesse. She had to admit that, but he was poor, and a wine-bibber, it was rumored. A squat, merry little man who sang and joked as he mended the carts of passing travelers, leaving the shop that adjoined their mean little cave of a house pretty much to his eldest son. Unlike his father, Joseph was rather sober, albeit he had a quick smile and a radiance about his eyes very pleasant to behold. Called forward to read the scriptures on the Sabbath, he came on a light, quick, pounding tread that seemed to stir all the girls seated in the gallery. Even Hannah felt his strong masculinity throughout her whole spare yet vital being. She did not miss the little tremor that ran through them, the unconscious leaning forward. All but Mary, who sat locked in her quiet poise, betrayed, though only by the half-smile on her lips, the fixed and shining look in her great eyes. He was older than Mary by some years. He should have long since taken a wife, but that he'd been waiting for her daughter Hannah knew, with a helpless sense of dismay and stubborn rejection. Many times over the years he'd come by the house on unnecessary errands to deliver a yoke that Joachim could have picked up himself, to bring an offering of his mother's fig cakes, to mend a trough. And he invariably lingered with Mary. Pictures plagued her. Joseph patiently picking out nut meats and popping them into Mary's innocent mouth. 14-year-old Joseph hoisting the basket of olives to his own shoulder as she struggled up from the common orchard behind the town. And once, when unexpected clouds had sent down an avalanche, he picked her up and carried her bodily across the swirling waters. Hannah would never forget their laughter or the look of his streaming face as he set her down on her own doorstep. And though Mary had been scarcely 11 then, and he almost 18, Hannah had felt a sense of dark outrage. "Never let such a thing happen again," she had said severely. "What would people think?" "That I was pouring. It was pouring out, and the streets were such a torrent that I must have been swept away and drowned." Swept away indeed. Swept away, and away, into youth and longing and dreaming and foolishness and the mistakes that were forever waiting to overtake those who imagined themselves in love. But she had guarded Mary well. She had made it plain in many ways, not only to Joseph himself, but his parents, yes, and the soft-hearted Joachim, that a match was out of the question. They had not had the boldness to ask. But until Joseph had settled on another girl and the banns were announced, Hannah could not rest easy. Mary, their Mary. She was meant for a finer fate than toiling and bearing children for a poor young carpenter. So we bring to a close Chapter 1 of the book Two from Galilee by Marjorie Holmes. We'll continue tomorrow, beginning with a summary of what we've just read, and moving on as we see what happens in the love story of Mary and Joseph on Two from Galilee.